hiccups based on just how it was designed. So there's a constant monitoring with a human in the loop to make sure these things are kicking out accurate data. Okay, and so yes, very important, very important. Anybody else had another comment or topic before I go into this the AI designed drug nearing late stage trials? Okay, I'm going to continue. So this is the first AI totally generated drug that's nearing late stage trials. Okay, it's called rentosertib, and it's for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, which is called scarring of the lung. And it is went through a trial, phase one, phase two, and now it's gearing up to go through phase three trials. Okay, and so I wanted to talk about this because not a lot of emphasis being talked about in the mainstream about generative chemistry, which I think is really, really important, especially if all of a sudden we have these new drugs that are totally generated with AI introduced in the marketplace. What are some of the problems that can happen? Now, we know that there is no cure for pulmonary fibrosis, so there is a need for a cure for this. But what are the issues? Okay, so rentositrib is an AI generated first in its class small molecule being developed for IPF. AI was used for target discovery and prioritization and general design of a small molecule leads lab plus clinical work followed standard practice. Okay, that's kind of what happened. And so we're talking about a real clinical trial. We're not talking about what happened with COVID, where they just kind of like shotgun through the clinical process and introduced to the market. This is a real clinical trial. You know, it used to be like 10 years before you introduce a drug to the market. But this is kind of like me going over a real clinical trial and looking at, man, this is a generative drug that was totally done with generative AI. So in a 71 patient phase two trial for 12 weeks, the 60 milligrams showed a 98% change uh, versus a negative 23 change in a placebo. So the next step is a longer trial to confirm efficacy and characterize it as safe or not. Okay, and so including liver-related events noted in phase two. So what happened is I think they had 128 patients. 71 of them actually were accepted into the trial. Okay, and so um, there are new therapies that are needed in IPF. Okay, and so progressive scarring of the lung, worsening breathing, and cough. And the U.S. prevalence is about 10 to 60 people per 100,000 uh, have IPF, according to some research. And the median survival diagnosis was cited as about 2 to 4 years. So I'm not a doctor. This is just research for educational use. Uh, and what they're saying is if you have IPF diagnosis, they're saying that the survival rate is about 2 to 4 years. So there is a need, there is no cure. So the current standard of care for the decline of fibrosis, reversing fibrosis remains an unmet need. So this drug was generative, and it's the first one that's nearing phase three trials. And so the drug is called rentisertib. Like I said, China is the country that introduced this. Here's some information about it if you want to research it. But phase two, what they did was basically had three dosing regimens for 12 weeks. You had patients that took 30 milligrams once a day, 30 milligrams twice a day, and then 60 milligrams once a day. Okay. And so the primary readouts in phase two included safety and tolerability and lung function. So that's kind of what they did. They did a 12 weeks clinical trial on this drug that was totally created with generative AI. It identified, a regulator of IPF, which is scarring of the lung, um, you know, and looking at, pro-inflammatory cells and programs. And basically what they try to do is just to reduce the disease, to preserve normal lung function. And this is kind of a breakdown uh, of what the drug does. It identifies inflammation in the lung, and then rituximab inhibits that, and then the lung function will decline based on that, over time. But rituximab is just something that they're using to try to lessen the scarring of the lung. So that's kind of what this particular drug is for. And so this is how AI contributed to this trial. Okay. And we're talking about generative chemistry here right now. Okay. So you have the data, right? The AI basically looked at the data, the literature, all the health networks that are around this particular area, and then it ranked targets from evidence. Okay, and then what it did with generative chemistry is it proposed a molecule, and then you had lab validation using real chemists in the lab, and then you had the clinical trials. Okay, so what AI designed drug means here in plain language is AI accelerated early discovery, promising as a promising fibrosis target and generating candidate chemical structures to inhibit it. Okay, so let me say that again. AI accelerated early discovery of a target candidate chemical structure. Okay, the candidate still required chemical synthesis, biological testing, toxicology testing, manufacturing, and conventional clinical trial. AI is just a tool in the pipeline, not a replacement for experimental validation or regulatory evidence. And so that's what we have to keep our ears to the street on with regulatory evidence. Because if we have, all these pharmaceutical companies, using generative AI to create all these new forms of drugs, what are the harmful effects? What are the things that are coming down the pike? What are some of the problems that could happen in the different demographics or targeted targeted solutions on, introducing this to people without doing a real study? Okay. So, so what kind of study was this? This was called a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study. That's really what you need for these drugs. And that's what used to take 10 years. Okay. We're talking about a randomized double-blind study. And so at a glance, like I said, 71 people were enrolled, 22 sites in China were reported. They had a placebo. Then they did it for 12 weeks. Okay. And so it was basically looking at lung function. And so here's some more efficacy data, just kind of showing you. And yeah, they did have a placebo. And so this is kind of like a breakdown for those of you who are just kind of looking at graph. This is to kind of just to illustrate some of that information. And then you have more information about the safety snapshot. There were some adverse effects. I guess some people had some liver issues. And so what needs to happen now is in the phase three, more people and in a longer trial. Okay, so that's kind of what goes into a research, a clinical trial study. And so here's another illustration where it stands and what's next. AI accelerated early discovery. Late stage proof is still depends on the clinical outcome. So we have the early discovery, you have the lead generation, You have healthy volunteers who step up and say, "Hey, I want to participate." And then you have people who are, you know, um, they're in the trial because they're sick. You have some people, some patients who volunteer to participate because they've been diagnosed. Okay, so phase three is a longer study. Okay, and then you have regulatory review if things look like successful. And so the key takeaway here is AI appears most impactful in the front end, which means like, and I'm talking specifically generative chemistry. AI appears most impactful on the front end with discovery and designing the molecule. Okay. So the clinical success still depends on phase three. Okay. And so none of the AI discovered drugs have been completed in a phase three trial. Okay. So for decision makers, treat AI design as an acceleration claim, not as a clinical evidence it's in itself. Okay. So that's kind of what I wanted to put in there on that. So that's kind of my breakdown and takeaways of generative chemistry and the first AI designed drug that's in a clinical trial. And so for me, I wanted to show you guys just an illustration of what fibrosis looks like. Um, this is a illustration of that. It's just basic scarring of the lung, and that's kind of what this drug was introduced to try to fight. So in 2025, generative AI moved from content into discovery, helping propose new drug candidates and new inorganic materials to test. So this next slide, these are some of the drugs that have been used in generative AI. A fibrosis drug, which I just talked about, a neuro drug, an oncology drug, antibiotics, new materials, and materials uh, data sets. So these examples are research to clinical candidates. Not all are approved for medicines or commercial materials yet. Now, what I did here is I want to give you guys a breakdown. You know, like the periodic table of elements that you learn. Well, they've indexed and sequenced the periodic table to create new materials. Okay, and so this is a periodic style comparison grid. Each tile represents what it is, what AI contributed to it, what it's used for, and the maturity so far. Okay, so I said retentive, a fibrosis drug. AI designed a small molecule for IPF. That was in 2025. These results were published. Okay. Now, in 2020, there was a drug for I think it was an AI assisted drug discovery program for OCD. So there was a drug that was created with AI that never made it to phase two, and that was back in 2020, and it's called DSP 1181. Okay, for OCD. The next one here on the right, EX, uh, AI designed a A2A antagonist for tumors, solid tumor immunotherapy. Okay, clinical trial registered, but I don't think they completed that clinical trial for the oncology drug. And then you have an antibiotic drug that is a machine learning guided identification. So it's something called albosin, and that's an antibiotic, and it's preclinical right now. So they haven't went through a clinical trial for that antibiotic. Now this next one, TACRO, is a new material, a generative material that's being used to create a new form of battery. They're trying to create new materials to create a battery, a new type of battery, to get off of some of the other materials that are, in the ground, but using generative AI to create inorganic candidates to create batteries. And then you have GM, which is the data set, the material. It's a platform that you use for generative material to create new materials. Okay, and so that's a data set. So I wanted to show that. Okay, so it's used for target discovery, molecule design, and property guided material generation. And so this is the actual intensitib molecule for those of you, and that's the number, you can research that. But this is kind of what these generative chemistry platforms are doing. They're just generating molecules, and then the chemists would synthesize this stuff in the lab, and then they would move forward with that. So that's kind of what I wanted to do with that slide. Now, this is something that is just more of a breakdown of grid. You can kind of read that. I'm not going to read all of that, but it shows you the different uh, generative um, stuff. So with renticertive, generative AI help discover, target the pathway, link the design with the DP screening and optimization of the candidate, uh, the the antibiotic machine learning compounds against different dangerous pathogens, and then you have generative AI proposed materials with mechanical properties. So there's a platform called MatterGen that researchers are using to create hard, high bulk materials. Okay. And then the genome generated crystal candidates. This is the one that's being used like deep learning crystal structures to make potential use in batteries, superconductors, energy materials. And so Google DeepMind reported about 2.2 million generated candidates, including about 38,000 stable materials. Now, these are just research candidates, not products yet. But this is where we're at. So we'll have generative AI creating new materials to make hard uh, products, hard materials that are using MatterGen that includes, an index sequence of the table of elements to create new things that have never been created before, like inorganic molecules and materials. So I just wanted to share that slide. And so what stands out here? What stands out for me is the biggest pattern is that AI is doing two different jobs now. In drug discovery, it is helping narrow chemical spaces for faster and move candidates like, reticertib and towards the clinic. In material science, systems like MatterGen and the genome are generating entire new inorganic candidates for batteries, hard materials, superconductors, and other advanced technologies. The second big point is that these examples are not all the same maturity level. When Tersative is one of the strongest public examples because it has published mid-stage clinical data, while Abusin is still a research stage antibiotic discovery, and many AI-generated materials remain in candidate structures and still need synthesis and validation. The third point is that AI is not replacing chemistry or biology. It is acting more like a search and design accelerator, helping researchers explore huge spaces of possible molecules and crystal structures for far faster than any brute force approaches. Okay, so we're talking about all these different things that are moving together at the same time. You have science materials being generated with AI, and then you have other aspects. So this is a breakdown for those of you who are into chemistry or may know somebody. Uh, this is what we go into making an AI generated battery material. Okay. Where generative chemistry is producing promising hard material. We're talking about solid electrolytes, cathodes, electrolyte solvents, anodes, novel solid compounds. So this is what's happening in real time right now because of all this stuff that happened with MatterGen and then sequencing the table of elements. Okay, so you're looking at fast screening, closed loop search. Okay, so AI is um, really coming forward with creating new materials, which is, I would say the biggest, the highest level of, technology and research. All right, so this is my works cited. I just wanted to share this with you guys so you guys can check it out. This is just where I got some of my research. You got all these, information from the Nature of Medicine. You got the Nature of Biotechnology, articles at nature.com, clinical trials from the U.S. National Library of Medicine. So all this stuff you can look up. It's all uh, real world